Hey there, welcome back again. This has been a book that I intended to review for quite a while, but just like Justin Doerr's Temple of Silence, the works of Herbert Crowley, it means so much to me and it's so important that I wanted everything to be perfect, and that can be a trap. Just let go of perfection. And the book that I'm talking about today, let me grab this Will Vanna White it with Grindle, is Krazy. George Herriman, A Life in Black and White. Great subtitle on that anyways. And it's by Michael Tizaran. And Michael Tizaran has done a couple of previous books. Very much worth checking out. But the way that I found out about Krazy was he presented a lecture for Google. It's approximately 50 minutes long, and he talks about the book, Michael Tizaran's life, his research process, yada, yada, yada. I stumbled across this one time when Boo was on a business trip, and I was just going through YouTube and found this. I'd always appreciated Krazy Kat, but after watching that, my mind was blown. So I will link to that lecture below because he does a much better job at summarizing what I'm going to do in a very brief review of the book. And I basically want to cover the book. For those of you, if you don't know, which would be surprising, George Herriman Krazy Kat is considered one of the top 100 comics of the 20th century. And I'm not just creating biography or hyperbole there. That was actually voted by the Comics Journal. Krazy Kat came out as the #1 comic. I believe Schultz's Peanuts was #2, which is surprising given the cultural impact of Peanuts, but it just goes to show you how amazing Krazy Kat actually was. I mean, Krazy Kat ran in papers from 1913 until 1944, and that period of time should show you some of its longevity. However, Michael Tizaran does an incredible job. This book is exhaustive. I mean, the amount of research he put into this, I would love to know the amount of years that it took him. It must have been at least over 5, if not a decade or more, because the amount of digging that he did into the Herriman family's history and the history of newspapers and cartooning in general during this time period is absolutely incredible. This pairs very well with Eddie Campbell's The Goat Getters, which I'll review further on because that was another of like the holy trio almost of early cartooning that kind of drew me in. Oh, there's a Winsor McCay biography as well. I'm a bear of limited intelligence. I was going to screw that up. What makes Krazy, A Life in Black and White so fascinating is he starts with the Herriman family in New Orleans. And Herriman's father, George Herriman, and his family were very influential in trying to get schools integrated. And this is before 1900 even hits. So we're barely historically past the Civil War, yet they're in New Orleans. They have the first black-owned newspaper is established. They're trying to get school integration, and they're moving for free blacks to be able to vote. It's just an incredible time period. Of course, there's a backlash against this. After some violent incidents take place, George Herriman's father, also named George Herriman, I'm not quite sure if he's a senior because I think there was multiple in the families. Read the book and find out. Definitely just go out and buy this book immediately, but let's continue on here. George Herriman's father decides to move the family away from New Orleans to Los Angeles. And this is where the story gets interesting because George Herriman's birth certificate, and this first surfaced in an article in 1973, is marked as colored. But when the Herrimans moved to Los Angeles, their race is then marked down as white. So they were passing. And passing was it's still a big thing, but it was a much larger thing at the time. And Tizaran wonderfully evokes not only the political circumstances and daily life in New Orleans in very vivid colors, But he also talks about this concept of passing and how detrimental it was. And there's multiple stories of people that are outed for passing, or when the funeral examiner accidentally removes a wig and discovers Ethiopian hair. Sequindle doing air quotes here. I'm not quite sure what he's ever doing. It's kind of, Doctor Strangelove over there. But there's multiple instances of this where they talk about somebody passing and being discovered. And this could be very dangerous for the Herrimans, because later on, George Herriman marries a white woman, buys a house in a neighborhood which specifically has a clause that anybody not Caucasian will be stripped of their holdings and evicted from the neighborhood. So there was a lot of stuff going on at the time. Now, Herriman, as a young man, starts submitting cartoons, and this is another great thing that the book covers, and I love the story of early cartooning. Once again, Eddie Campbell's The Go-Getters, perfect complement to this, because they both talk about the importance of the sporting pages to American cartooning. Something that used to be glossed over and is starting to be reclaimed nowadays. People are starting to acknowledge the fact of the move from the sports papers onwards in the development of newspaper cartooning. A big thing that was going on at the time was Jack Johnson took the heavyweight prize, and this created the color line. And so most newspapers at the time when they were doing this, they were decrying the danger to the white race and the uncivilized aspect of sporting. And the sporting life was very important at the time. It was a whole separate social cachet. So all the other newspapers that were doing this were just kind of hammering away at the dangers of crossing the color line. Herriman's cartoons use this to kind of poke fun at it. And at the same time, he's still passing. But his friends would often call him George the Greek, because, as they said, they weren't quite sure. His skin was just off enough, and he had, I can't remember what they called it, he had nappy hair. And so a lot of Herriman's photos, his youngest photo, you can actually see him without a hat. From then on, he always wore a hat, inside and out. So Herriman covers the fight sympathetically, and there's a whole thing. I would suggest you go watch Michael Tezeran's lecture, because he goes in depth in this, and like I said, buy the book, and also get Eddie Campbell's The Go-Getters, because it's a fascinating history. As a side note, once I became interested in this, I started to discover the books written by newspapermen of the time, and as I've said before, they are almost like the true crime craze that is out now. So there was a lot of them. Some of them are hysterical, because newsrooms at the time, the newspaper rooms are just sheer madness, the amount of craziness that was going on. It's a beautiful history that I don't think gets talked about enough. Anyways, Herriman hops a freight train, not quite sure whether he paid for his ticket, to New York, ends up in Coney Island, and this is perfect, like Luke Santee material. And if you know Luke Santee and how much I love him, yeah, you're going to enjoy the hell out of this book. He ends up in Coney Island, starts knocking door to door at all the newspaper offices trying to get a job. And this, once again, meticulously researched, very vividly told. Absolutely loved this part of the story. So, Herriman knew that his tenure as a cartoonist almost needed a steady strip. This was the direction that everything was moving. And at the time, cartooning was not an art form that it had been cemented down. It was still very much in flux. People were trying different styles, different ways of evoking moods, where it would go if it was on the sports page, the fashion page. And this was pre-photography, so cartoonists were very much needed in order to convey the full story of any event that occurred. So Herriman tried a couple of different ideas for a recurring strip. He tried the Dingbats, which was about a family that was living in a tenement, I believe. Could be wrong on that. And then he tried another one, which I did not know about, called Baron Bean. And this is the collected. Who did this? I thought it was, it's IDW that created that. But Herriman was a huge fan of Charlie Chaplin at the time, and he created Baron Bean almost as a Charlie Chaplin figure, kind of events in the spirit of Charlie Chaplin. And on an interesting side note, a fascinating book to read is Erotic Grotesque Nonsense. And I believe that's by Miriam Silverman. I'll put the cover up there in case I screwed it up. Wonderful book because it talks about the advance of modernity into Japan prior to World War II. And when Charlie Chaplin went to Japan, there was actually plans for an assassination attempt because he was so beloved by the world. You should absolutely read that book. Fascinating material in there as well. And one of the stories I love is Charlie Chaplin, whenever he visited another country, the first thing that he would ask is he wanted to visit the prisons because that was the true test of a country. So that just shows you the spirit of Charlie Chaplin, how much he meant to people, and Herriman naturally gravitating towards him. Because the one thing that comes through throughout this book is Herriman was an extremely humble and gentle man. And I don't mean gentleman, I mean he was a gentleman. There's a story in there about one of his friends relaying a story when they were driving and a bee flew into the car. Herriman had him pull over to the side of the road so he could shush the bee out instead of, killing it. So, a very gentle, soft-spoken man. So it makes sense that he would gravitate to Charlie Chaplin. So Herriman creates Krazy Kat. And the beautiful thing about Krazy Kat is Krazy Kat, he kind of used not only to explore questions of race in a very subtle manner, he also used it to explore the idea of beauty. And one of the things that's talked about in the book a lot is Herriman is taken to Monument Valley, Arizona, where he falls in love with not only the landscape, but the Navajo and Hopi people of the area. And it goes to the point where he finds that there's a TB asylum, and I believe it's Cayente, Arizona, and he wants to give back to them for being so open and welcoming to him. So he arranges for a movie projection system to be installed within this asylum. One of the funny stories that you hear about is the white people in attendance when they were watching these movies, because weekly Herriman would send westerns and various movies back to Cayente for them to watch. And the whites were always mystified in the audience that when Navajo or Hopi Indians that were used as extras in the film spoke, and often during dramatic scenes or whatever, the Navajo and Hopis in the audience would burst out laughing. And nobody found out at the time, I don't think, but what was going on was the Navajo and Hopi extras that were in the film were improvising their lines and usually making derogatory remarks about their fellow actors that they were totally unaware of. So you get all this great stuff about newsrooms that were going on at the turn of the century. You have Hearst, which everybody should look more into Hearst newspapers. Herriman also worked for Pulitzer. Krazy Kat itself, its big fans were like T.S. Eliot, Langston Hughes, Picasso, E.E. Cummings, and it was said that E.E. Cummings had postered his entire dorm room at Harvard with Krazy Kat cartoons, and you can see this language creeping in. And the Surrealists were also huge fans of Krazy Kat, to the point where someone suggested that it shouldn't be that the Surrealists appreciate Krazy Kat, but Krazy preceded the Surrealists themselves. So anybody with an interest in history and cartooning, one of the things he talks about is when he was in New York, Herriman ran in the same circles as the artists that were responsible for putting on the Armory show, which if you have watched my review about Justin Durer's The Temple of Silence with Mary Monboy Clark and everything, that's a very good intersection of those worlds. So these worlds were tightly knit, everybody kind of knew everybody else that was going on. And the importance of the Armory show can't be overstated at this point. It's just another bit of not lost history, but it's not really that well known to the general public. And Krazy Kat itself is a comic. The wonderful thing going on now is we're getting great republishings. Because if you try reading Krazy Kat, a squash down size doesn't work so well. But Fantagraphics is releasing the daily strips in this pretty large volume we got going on here. And those are great. And Taschen has the complete Sunday editions, which Kathleen bought me for Christmas a while ago. And when Herriman died, E. Cummings was such a huge fan of the strip that he approached the publishers going, nobody's going to know about these strips if they're not collected and preserved. He collected a bunch of the strips, wrote an opening essay to the collection, and then that collection, Charles Schulz read that returning home from World War II, and it was a huge influence on Charles Schulz in creating Peanuts, because then he said he saw the potential that was there in comic strips. And it's even to the point that the Charlie Brown shirt, that stripe pattern that you see, is actually taken from Navajo designs, because he was so influenced by Herriman, and Herriman would do these beautiful backgrounds. I mean, the backgrounds on Herriman strips are almost more important than the foreground characters. They're just beautifully rendered, and you'll see these Navajo designs put all throughout. So Schultz was also a huge fan of this. Dr. Seuss is another one. His animals that you see that Dr. Seuss creates could almost come out of a Krazy Kat strip. And the other beautiful thing is Krazy Kat crossed gender lines. At one moment, he would be referred to as a he, the another one a she. Ignatz, the mouse who's in love with Krazy Kat and is constantly throwing the brick at him, is even confused as to the gender identity of Krazy Kat. And this became a touchstone for gay culture at the time. There were even Krazy Kat clubs, and it was kind of like a secret password, if you will. So once again, the hidden history of America. There's also a love triangle with Officer Pup. I would just say, simply get the book and enjoy the hell out of it. It's such a beautiful book. If it piques your interest, definitely watch Michael Tisserand's Google Talk, because that is utterly fascinating in itself. And pick up the book. Check out Fantagraphics reprints of them, because the wonderful thing about Krazy Kat, there's so much wordplay in there. Herriman was a huge fan of Cervantes' Don Quixote, Shakespeare, Aesop's Fables. You will see them all within the strip, and there's so much wordplay and punning. Sometimes you just have to, if I don't get a strip at first, you sit there and kind of marinate on it. Read it over and over, and reading it out loud. Just like James Joyce, don't over-intellectualize it. Read it out loud and let the words play around. Either the artwork, the wordplay, something's going to click to you. It's just a beautiful comic strip. And Michael Tisserand did an absolutely marvelous job of encapsulating just how wonderful this is. At this point, I think I've rambled on a little bit too much for anybody's patience. So I love you all, and I'll see you next Wednesday. Bye.